is my distinct pleasure this afternoon to welcome our next keynote speaker. Amity Shlaes is the author of 4 New York Times bestsellers: The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression; The Forgotten Man Graphic Edition, a full-length illustrated version of the same book by Paul Revouche, drawn by Paul Revouche, I should say; Coolidge, a full-length biography of the 30th president; and The Greedy Hand, How Taxes Drive Americans Crazy. National Review called The Forgotten Man the finest history of the Great Depression ever written. The Economist wrote of Coolidge that the book deserves to be widely read and made it an editor's choice for 2013. The Forgotten Man Graphic Edition reached the #1 spot in its bestseller category. Now, Amity is also, she chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, a national foundation based in the birthplace of President Coolidge. The foundation's goal is to share Coolidge with Americans by hosting high school debates and a number of other programs. And in fact, the foundation is host to the most prestigious or most hotly contested college scholarship in America, a full ride for academic merit to any college. Amity has won 4 Market and Conservative prizes: the Bradley, the Bastiat, the Hayek, and the Buckley Prize for Political Thought. She is currently writing a history of the Gilded Age and a short history of the U.S. economy. Please join me in welcoming Amity Shlaes.
I'm very grateful to those of you who did not get up and go out and get a Diet Coke or whatever you would do. Thank you for having me. I'd like to recognize my colleague, Nathaniel Cameron, who's over there from the Coolidge Foundation. We are small but mighty and new on the scene, so we're glad to see these new programs as well. Good afternoon. One of my 2 predecessors said there are a lot of periods you can look at. Today I'm just going to look at one period, one model intensely rather than float about. It's the Great Depression and the New Deal. So that's the 1930s. And I think I will allow myself an aside as to how I got into the New Deal and the Great Depression. I was on the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, where I worked for the wonderful editor Bob Bartley, and I said, a lot of things that are happening now seem to trace back to institutions, SCC and LRB. Behind those acronyms are institutions established in the New Deal in the 1930s, so I'm going to write a book about that. And he said, you can't. And I said, why not, dear boss? And he said, because I haven't decided what happened yet in the New Deal. That is, the New Deal is kind of the Rosetta Stone for economics and also often for political thinking. It's made me, of course, all the more interested in undertaking a review of the New Deal, and I did write a book about it. It is important. It is the single event that one does want to study. And is relevant to today. You hear people talking about the New Deal now, and you're thinking, oh, New Deal, fair deal, square deal, well, TR, Truman. Let's just do the New Deal, this period. It's the most important federal intervention in the U.S. economy in peacetime in our history. It matters, it's exciting, it's compelling, and it warrants our study. So I'm just going to review for you briefly what actually happened. And I think a sub-theme of my remarks is humility. We don't always know how economies work, and as clever as we might be, and as large our vocabulary, and as much as we're star students, many of people with those visions of themselves have gone before and stumbled when trying to manage an economy. Also, when I speak, I should mention you want to think about the individual and his soul versus the group, because these were themes in the period, and also the difference between key political success on the one hand, what makes for good talk radio, what makes for votes, and actual outcome on the other. Those two can diverge quite dramatically. If you go back to the early 30s, there are some parallels to today, and you picked that up in the preceding discussion. One is the shock of suddenly sensing you might be living in a period of war. that does change the domestic mood. In this period, the early 30s, men with guns were going to houses and taking the fathers away to be hostages somewhere unknown, in particular in Germany and Russia. And that was a new thing. Germany and Russia had historically been, quote unquote, like us, civilized places you might like to live. Tens of thousands in Germany in the early part of 1933, after the rise of Hitler, whom people didn't know whether to rate an efficiency expert, a demagogue, or a villain yet, right? So the shock of war was being felt at home. And then in addition, there was economic darkness or confusion enveloping us. Today, we consider 5% unemployment a little bit high. The unemployment in the early 1930s was 20%, so that would be 1 in 5 men. Women largely didn't work. So 1 in 5 bread earners for a household was out of work. That's pretty disconcerting all by itself. And there was a lot of discussion about what to do about this depression that had arrived. The preceding decade had been rather splendid in terms of growth and in terms of gains for individual Americans. So some of the ways people talked about addressing the depression, nobody really knew why it was there. Well, there was a monetary discussion, but there was also a large antitrust component. The big companies of the period were the octopi, so people talked about cutting off the tentacles of the octopus, reducing the power of great companies in that period, the great companies which everyone assumed would be the great companies forever. The monopolies were the automakers, the rulers of the U.S. economy. It's different to today, but every era has its giants, which seem permanent, although they aren't. There was new technology. There was a sense of hostility against the Davos elite, though we used other terms in the 30s, the rich people. They were called, people complained that there was an aristocratic anarchy, that there were American aristocrats who did have castles. For example, in Newport, Rhode Island, you've seen Gilded Age. The rich people were living there, and they were depriving the rest, and the many unemployed. And there was a strong discussion about the need to raise wages on another theory, which is if workers have more money, they can provide better for their families, but also they will spend and get the economy going. So it was a sort of proto-Keynesianism, as we would put it. Keynes himself wasn't running around America putting up signs for this yet. He hadn't even completed the great opus that suggests the merit of spending. So it was I would say pre-Keynesianism. And there was discussion of the need for regime change. There was also an exhaustion with the older advisors. We had come, and that's similar to, we come out of a period of free marketeers, laissez-faire people. They were earlier generations, but it was the same. So imagine the Reaganites of that period. They were older, they were yesterday. We, a Republican or a Democrat, were going to do something new. And you have to always acknowledge that all battles are not only are battles of talent versus establishment, but they're also battles of young v. old. They always are. And young has its place. Young has insights, right? Youth has its insights, but it's also a generational contest. It's human nature. The president who came to fulfill the collection of impulses, and some of them contradicted each other, was Franklin Roosevelt. His primary promise was to put America back to work. He would show also how America was different from overseas. What we would do would reduce the likelihood of the terrible incursions, murders, and massacres, and nighttime arrests that were happening overseas. And he would put America to work by revolutionizing procedure at home. Actually, Roosevelt wasn't quite sure how. That raised prices idea was in the wind. The antitrust ideas were in the wind. And at one point, he was a great antitruster later in his presidency, not right away. He would try everything. He promised to try everything. And actually, he demanded and received through a strong support at the polls a mandate to experiment. He didn't say, I will do this and only this. He said bold, persistent experimentation, which is a bigger mandate, right? Not just the platform is running, but I am running for my mandate. Later, I will decide. And there was enormous enthusiasm for that in the period of 1 in 5 unemployed. The humorist Will Rogers, who's way underrated, said, well, if he would just burn a house down, we'd say, look, at least somebody did something. At least somebody did something. Even while he was still a candidate, Roosevelt gave a key speech on the radio on the Lucky Strike hour. It was the era of cigarettes. And he tried to develop a political philosophy. And he said, I'm going to do something for somebody he called the forgotten man. All politicians at one point or another talk about the forgotten man, but Roosevelt was the first really loud one. And he defined his forgotten man, a class, the poor, the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. He would undertake for that man, and note that it's a group, a class, the poor, the people at the bottom of the pyramid. So if you put it in algebra, the rich man is A, or the leader is A, and the poor man down there is X at the bottom, or Z, X. Always pay attention to the speechwriter. The speechwriter in that case, or one of them for the Lucky Strike speech, was a man named Ray Moley, who's wonderful, and went on to found Newsweek later and a lot of other institutions you've encountered. Moley at the time wrote his sister, I don't really know where we got that forgotten man's phrase, but it kind of resonated, so we went with it, right? Actually, he wasn't lying. He probably really didn't remember. But Forgotten Man did have a provenance even then. There was a political philosopher, very famous in his era, but now forgotten, named William Graham Sumner. And Sumner had 2 generations before written and taught thousands about a forgotten man, likewise using an algebra. So A wants to help X. Okay. B wants to help X. Oh, we have X is here. Yeah, B wants to help X. Okay, A and B get together. They're very clever, and they concoct a plan to help X. All right, good plan, bad plan, nobody knows. Comes the problem when A and B coerce the other people in the room, the other people in the world, a third party, unknown C, into supporting and likewise funding their maybe good, maybe bad project for X. C is the forgotten man, said Sumner. He's the man who pays, the man who prays, the man who is not thought of. And that is where I got the title from my book, from these 2 forgotten men, different notions. Roosevelt's notion is classes, starting with the poor as a class. Sumner is the forgotten man is the one who doesn't happen to fall into a group that is getting a political favor at this moment, or who may be the collateral damage for a well-meaning undertaking. Quite different. And people in the era did recall Sumner, so they'd say, oh, yes, Roosevelt as the right forgotten man or the wrong forgotten man. But anyway, there it was in the air. Sumner was dead. Roosevelt was president with a strong mandate. Roosevelt wasn't exactly sure what he would do, but he wanted to do something big, bump up wages, help farmers bump up prices, especially for commodities. Farmers were suffering in a deflation from very low commodity prices. Farm foreclosure was happening every week. There's a very famous law case, if you're going to law school, Blaisdell, about that, on farms, mortgages, in economic emergency. And the New Deal, as it was called, Roosevelt's New Deal for America, built a raft of institutions, what I had first noticed long at the Wall Street Journal, to provide to various groups of disadvantage. It was always thinking in terms of groups. Roosevelt was a great politician, so he had an eye to the group. Today we would call them, I don't know, protected groups, protected individuals, protected classes whom he would help. And he aimed to do it in a dramatic way because he did say, laissez-faire is last year. This is where we need to manage. We need to have antitrust, industrial policy, all these things he claimed he wanted to do at a certain point. There are also disfavored groups in the Roosevelt image. One was the wealthy. There was a strong increase in taxation, making it more progressive, and there was plenty of prosecution of rich people or figureheads from the old, quote-unquote, laissez-faire era. In particular, the former Treasury Secretary, I hope you never do this, Andrew Mellon, whom we admire very much and who should be restructuring our debt today. We'd be lucky to have him. He was out because he was a Republican. He was prosecuted throughout the 30s in a kind of show trial by the New Deal. So the bad rich people were prosecuted like crazy and were therefore idled. There was a shift for African Americans. Roosevelt at least promised that there were no forgotten men and there were no forgotten races in the United States. Principally, the thought for them was to provide jobs. Roosevelt spoke at Howard University right here and talked about that. There was help for families, in particular senior citizens, an important voting bloc and a very needy group. Social Security was written into law in this period. There was also reorganization of the industrial sector of the economy. So I would say something even industrial policy of a magnitude we can't even imagine. That in particular, the economic fad at that time was big is better, which goes against antitrust. Contradictions did not bother the New Dealers. Big is better because of the economy of scale. They were very much influenced by Mussolini's Italy. Mussolini's Italy was on the cover of Time. It was in fashion. If we get more efficient through efficiency and higher prices, we can work our way out of the Great Depression. That was a notion as well. How did this policy affect the land? Well, it was inspiring. It was almost like the war. There were rallies, New Deal, New America. Confidence is the answer. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Politically, it played fantastically. If you reward organized groups, they will reward you in the ballot box. There was a new law for organized labor called the Wagner Act, which created the NLRB and which we still work with today. When you get organized labor on your side, even then you get millions of votes. That act made it easier to strike and organize and harder to fight a union for a company. The election of 1936, which was the next election, was therefore a stupendous victory for Roosevelt. You've heard of that landslide, 46 out of 48 states. It made a mockery of the saying, as Maine goes, so goes the nation, because Maine was one of the two states that did not vote for Franklin Roosevelt. I believe the other was Vermont, which was Calvin Coolidge's state. Political flavors of states change. But the rest did vote for Roosevelt, and he was elected, as you know, again and again in 40 and 44. So politically, he is the most successful president in modern history in terms of just getting votes, being loved. But there's another set of data points one would want to contemplate, which are the economic data points. The New Deal had rewarded groups, specifically defined politicized groups, but it had not rewarded, it had failed in its central mission, which is to reemploy the worker. Its declared mission, unemployment stayed above 10% for the decade. And it actually often went in the wrong direction. What was shocking to me and what I commenced my history of the Great Depression with was in 1937, unemployment went up to 15% again. That was the so-called depression within the depression, a terrible downturn because it came so many years in, right? It's one thing to have a panic, which is what America was used to. It's another to have a kind of perma downturn. It makes the recovery from 2008, which was remarkably slow and very depressing, look like a picnic, the Great Depression. That's That's the data point. If you want to go further, you can look at the Dow, which did not return till much later. Even, I think, in the 1950s, there was a war, of course, that followed the Depression. That's an awful long time. If you would say today the Dow is at 33,000, and it will never come back to this level for 2 decades. Is that what we're all expecting with our 401ks and our savings plans? No. It was a very poor decline, or GDP, or even GDP per capita real. The U.S. economy did not reach 29 levels to the very end of the Great Depression decade. And that is not, by the way, because the 20s numbers were that inflated. They might have been inflated, but they couldn't have been as inflated enough to require a 10-year crash, a 10-year downturn. So economically, the New Deal failed. It put the great in the phrase Great Depression. Actually, recoveries are a bit like people. They make the choice to come back, or they make the choice to stay away. And one can anthropomorphize them to the extent that you look at the recovery like a visitor coming and taking a peek at the U.S. economy each year, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? And saying, this year I'll sit it out again. Each time, the recovery looked at us and made a choice. What this book is, which is offered to you, is there was commentary in real time, by the way, I should mention. People were trying to figure out why this was happening, why the Depression was going on so long, and they were making various cases. Some of them were hotheads, like Huey Long, very interesting to study. I highly recommend the Ken Burns documentary on Huey Long. So you can hear how he argued. He was a terrific polemicist. There were Southerners who spoke up. There were Northerners who spoke up. Ray Moley, the speechwriter of President Roosevelt, developed some doubt about the New Deal and spoke up very eloquently. But they were kind of, let's say, sidelined, marginalized, canceled in the 1930s, and they're not really evident except the worst of them, the bigots, in the history books. So recently I put together with another foundation, the American Institute of Economic Research, a collection of the writings of the critics of the New Deal from the 1930s. It's not what Amity thinks or what Milton Friedman thinks or any of us knows thinks. It's what they thought in real time. And we have not left out the people who say some things we don't approve of on other matters. I thought it was important to include everyone, even people whom I would care not to work with because they were also, say, bigots. I think it's important to look at the whole of the criticism. It was so disregarded, and even someone whom one doesn't like or approve of can sometimes offer wisdom that one might be interested in that spirit. So this is a book of those rebels. I just wrote the little intro. I want to read to you just a couple comments from it, and then I'll close. One of the things that happened was that we began, as part of the New Deal, we decided to manage agricultural supply. We thought if we would, that is we the government, reduce supply, then prices would go up. Okay. At the same time, people were starving, however, and to watch food being destroyed in the theoretical service of raising prices when your children are hungry is a terrible thing. In the state of Maine, they dyed all the potatoes blue so no one would eat them, so the potato price would go up. And in Maine, Maine's a poor state. Maybe that's why they didn't vote for the New Deal. This was a terrible perversion to observe. As a young officer in the New Deal, in the Youth Administration, Lyndon Johnson noticed that the horses had to pull the plow to plow over the crops to reduce supply so that the price of hay or grain would go up. And the horses did not want to step on the crops because all their lives, mules or horses, they had been trained to step over the crop. They bridled and would not go forward. And that was because the notion itself of reducing supply to raise price is a little creepy. Johnson wrote about this. He worked in that period. The entire economy bridled as well. And African Americans, even if they were a remembered group, suffered particularly because when we raised wages, we forced employers to raise wages. Well, what does an employer with no profits do when he's forced to raise wages? He employs fewer people and only the most skilled, right? So who is laid off? The less skilled worker. Who is that? African Americans. We shut the door to them in the name of unions and higher wages. And the writer I like best in the book is one named John Davis, not the John Davis, the politician, another one, African American, John P. Davis. And he talks about the industrial reform and the agricultural reform and the effect on African Americans. He says the promise of NRA to bring higher wages has glimmered away. An unemployed worker cannot eat a higher wage rate. It's no consolation to me if I have not the wage that you have a higher wage. As for what happened on the farms was that the less profitable, the less arable land was idled by the farmers because they knew they had to curtail the supply. They had orders. Who lived on that land? Tenant farmers. They were chased off and evicted. Who were they? Often African American. So Davis noted, as for evictions, the federal courts have now refused to allow tenants to stop and join such evictions. Faced with this Dred Scott decision by the New Deal against farm tenants, the AAA, the government agency, has remained silent. Farm laborers are now jobless by the hundreds of thousands, black ones and homeless. The result, Davis predicted, would be to perpetuate ghettos of Negroes for 50 years to come. There was a comment in a newspaper in Muncie, Indiana, that I found for the book, very far in, around 1937, 38, a letter writer wrote in, and he said, "Who is the forgotten man? Let's revive this discussion. I know him as intimately as I know my own undershirt. He is the fellow that is trying to get along without public relief and has been attempting the same since the Depression cracked down on him. The New Deal had not helped him." If you want to do sort of economic analysis of the errors, you can do some. I like very much the summary of an economist who's way underrated named Benjamin Anderson, because rather than come with monetary points about, I don't know, money supply, he was the chief economist of Chase Bank. He was a mainstream economist. He nonetheless moved out of economics to explain what it was transpiring in the US. He wrote a book which was published in 1945, but he wrote this part towards the end of the New Deal to summarize his book. "Preceding chapters," said this bank economist, "have explained the Great Depression of 1930 to 39 as due to the effort of governments, and very especially the government of the United States, to play God. When playing God had failed, overreaching, there were those who sought to assign the problem to defects in industry and finance. The theorists," Anderson concluded, "believed that once we had failed once, that the government, far from retiring from the role of God, must now play God yet more vigorously." Very interesting. Economist turns to theology, to the lexicon of theology, to try to capture the error in the New Deal. Technically, what was wrong? There are millions of books. My tiny bit of emphasis, or hopefully added value, was to argue that the labor price upward pressure really worsened the unemployment. And there's a fine economist at UCLA named Leo Hanyon who's written whole tomes about this. That is underrated in most explanations of the unemployment of the New Deal. When you push the labor price up, people rehire or lay off more frequently and hire more slowly. The second trouble was the license for regime change, was the ambition itself of the president and his program. Markets can live with some uncertainty, but if there's too much uncertainty, if you think you might be arrested, as many businessmen were, or dragged into court, or have a law written that bans your industry, basically, which is what happened with the Public Utilities Holding Company Act. Utilities were the most promising industry in the New Deal period, and they were basically strangled by law and competition from the government as well as prosecution. Then you retire to your second home. You have a COVID year or two. You stay back. You wait for better economic weather. And I believe that uncertainty generated by political ambition also prolonged the Great Depression. I also go back to that original discussion about the forgotten man. It's fun to help groups, and they vote for you, and you feel the power. But individuals often always get hurt. We always underestimate the collateral damage we do with a big project. The individual really matters more than the group. I like Sumner and his Forgotten Man, and Sumner is also canceled nowadays because he always thought about the individual rather than the group. Don't confuse political commercials that one might write to elect a certain candidate with actual economics and what actually transpires when you do something to the economy. We always make subpar trades to build political coalitions. That doesn't mean they're good economics, and we just have to be aware of that. But the final point I would make is humility. Actually, people don't quite understand why economies work. Adam Smith had some understanding, some others have had some understanding. But the idea that just because we are clever or speak faster, we won't make the errors that our predecessors made, I see as a fallacy. That is what the New Deal showed, that when we are arrogant, we do stupendous damage. So when you push for a new policy, you always have to think, has it been tried before? Look into that. How did it work? And might it hurt someone, including a forgotten man? That's all.
Thanks so much, Professor Shlaes. We have a few minutes for questions, and like I said earlier, we're going to prioritize student questions. So I see one over there.
Student questions, yeah.
Thank you. How effective do you think organizations like the TVA or the WPAA were, maybe not economically, but were helpful in relieving the kind of spiritual crisis facing the American worker at that time? I mean, it does something really detrimental to a person to sit idly by while you and your family starve.
I don't think the WPA, well, so we're distinguishing between works projects, hire people. There was a civilian conservation corps, which had a social element too. People got together and worked in the woods, and they built, state parks that you've been to. There were works projects that built town halls. There were little works projects, WPA, and big works projects, PWA. This was the period of the alphabet. There were many, many acronyms. Work projects are fine. Like if they didn't really have much effect on the economy. I don't think the despair in America was as great as alleged. When you go back and look at the period, you'll find over and over again people saying, we didn't know we were in the Great Depression. We were told that. We knew it was another bad year. So I think the element of crisis was hyped during the period and also afterwards. So were the people all as depressed as the government alleged at the time? Not necessarily all of the time. There were people who did well in the Great Depression. I would distinguish the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a mega project for a poor region. Very curiously, the Roosevelt administration thought about organizing the U.S. economy by river basins. Interesting, right? Regions, and when you do regions, you can get around state and federal and kind of make a new level of commissions and authorities, and that was part of it. One of the hypotheses relating to TVA was that water power was the future. That did not turn out to be right. It's not the most efficient kind of power. So underlying hypothesis wrong, incredible damage. I mentioned utilities before. Utilities were one of those industries that grow even in a depression, sort of like the internet now. They were the big engine that could. The utilities were in the process of electrifying the whole country. Not all the South had been electrified yet. That didn't mean it wouldn't be. My hero in my Forgotten Man book is a man named Wendell Willkie, who worked for a company called Commonwealth and Southern, whose mandate was to electrify the South. The South is tired of living in the dark, was the phrase. Cities had electricity, but not the South. Very much a corollary to our internet discussion. Willkie and a bunch of others, including some rather clever corporate governance and finance experts at Columbia, figured out a way to raise money on Wall Street for the capital-intensive, tough work of electrifying the South. What happened to Willkie and his company? One, they were prosecuted throughout the New Deal. Two, a law was passed that made it illegal for them to raise money in a big way across states, the Public Utilities Holding Company Act. Three, the government subsidized competition for them through the Rural Electrification Program, which sounded lovable. The South did get electricity from the government instead of Commonwealth and Southern and other companies. What did Willkie do? He gave up and sold the company to the government and went into politics. After a while, he was tired of it. So I think through the TVA and its energy policy, particularly its electricity policy generally, the New Deal impeded recovery very directly. And what's nice about Willkie is he wasn't angry in temperament. He was jovial and likable. And he said, look, you're telling the nation a bedtime story about what the state can do for poor people in the South. We were already doing it, just let us do it. And when he came to debate a New Dealer, it was Robert Jackson, who later became a Supreme Court justice. He trounced him because he said, look, please acknowledge that a company can do some of this. Don't make this into a fiction, that it's so expensive to electrify a place where that it will never happen, or that an innovation won't come along that obviates the need to lay tens of thousands of miles of wire, which is what the problem was at that time. That was the only way to electrify. Maybe something else will happen. Let's think about that. So he became, as the hero of the most promising industry, he became a hero for skeptics of the New Deal. So I'm not a fan of the TVA. Set aside what they did with fertilizer, whose consequences we live with today in every lake in the United States. One of the big things about the TVA was the enthusiasm for fertilizer, phosphates, because they had no awareness of the environment. So if you've been in a lake that's really a swamp, then you know what happens with fertilizer. Okay.
Got time for one more question.
Sorry I talked so long.
Thank you. Some people make this argument that the economy of the 20th century was structurally very different from the economy of the 19th century, say, because of technology or economies of scale and so forth. And the implication is, so the role of the government in the economy has changed also. So do you think fundamentally the Great Depression had the same kinds of causes and could have had the same solutions as past depressions, or do you think there were structural changes in the economy that made it unique, at least compared to preceding depressions?
I think the argument that the structural difference make us a different economy, and that's an argument that was made for the New Deal and is being made currently, is overrated. Of course, things are different, but at the time, they thought it was automobiles that were the monopolies, and the automakers, and utilities were the internet, and electrification was the internet. So I think that's overrated. We'd had plenty. What made the New Deal what made the Great Depression great. And, some of the characters in my books, as grown-ups, they lived through 5, 6 panics, where the stock market goes down more than 20%, maybe 40%, and unemployment goes to some high number. The difference between the Great Depression and all those preceding panics that, say, Coolidge lived through is the panics were short. They were panics. There's the so-called forgotten depression of the early 20s when unemployment did hit 15% for about 4 seconds, and then there was a reversal. The duration of the Great Depression was due to the unprecedented intervention. And now I'm writing a book about Gilded Age and Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm stunned to see the thoroughness of the case that Theodore Roosevelt caused the Panic of 1907 through antitrust action. There's Robert Bruner of UVA Darden, wrote a brilliant book about it. I'm not saying that's the only case. I'm saying the case is solid. It's not just some made-up argument, because railroads were put up as the poster child of companies that could never be defeated, that would take over the whole U.S. economy and own all the land if they were not prosecuted and regulated vigorously. It turned out they were very fragile. They fell apart, they collapsed, Panic of 1907. I'm only slightly oversimplifying. Then Roosevelt that was TR, not Franklin, had to go to the very people he'd vilified and beg them for help to halt a panic. The panic was halted. But I think from the first progressive impulse and all the regulation and attention from the government, the railroad industry never recovered, because right around the corner on the horizon coming at the railroads were trucks, the industry that would make them almost irrelevant in our today's discussion. That is, monopolies are often beaten by the natural force of innovation far more thoroughly than any antitrust actor could beat them.
Join me in giving another round of applause to Professor Shlaes. Thank you.